Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress for what I think is going to be quite an interesting conversation with Harvard Law professor Jack Goldsmith about his new book, After Trump, Reconstructing the Presidency. I think, we'll also talk to Jack a little bit today about some current events, but I'd like to focus more on the book and his recommendations for reconstructing the presidency and revising some of the laws that constrain and define the powers of the presidency as an institution that concerns itself with the relationship between the executive and the legislative branch. Obviously, this is an important topic to us. Many of our observers today will note that a lot of our work has been focused on the general health of the political system, how our electoral system unfortunately incentivizes some of the worst kind of behaviors that we see in politics. Specifically, we find that our electoral process tends to incentivize a lack of cooperation, where our Constitution requires at least a small amount of cooperation between members of political parties to do the basics, to get a budget done on time, and attend to the pressing needs of the country. And instead, our system tends to prioritize the partisan battling and the stuff that gets you covered well in the news, or often on the news, but not really tends to be very useful for the governing of the country. I appreciate Professor Goldsmith's time with us today, but also his effort in putting together this book in reconstructing institutions. I do want to note that the project is a bipartisan one, one that he did together with a Democratic colleague, Bob Bauer, and I believe Jack, although he has, in addition to his Harvard law creds, the credibility of having been within government and representing multiple departments of the executive in the George W. Bush administration, including serving as an assistant attorney general. I think he described himself now as an independent, but I'll let him talk about that in his opening comments. But it is important that they did a joint project and tried to come to some common perspectives on changes that, let's say, most reasonable observers might agree are due. Even if we can have some legitimate debate about how to implement, various approaches to reform. I do want to note from something I found interesting in the preface in terms of Professor Goldsmith's description of the Trump presidency. He noted, and I'm going to just quote quickly from the text, quote, "Trump operated the presidency in ways that defied widely held assumptions about how a president might use and abuse the powers of the office." It goes on later to say, "His words and actions exposed the presidency's vulnerability to dangerous excesses of authority and dangerous weaknesses in accountability." I think that really does capture a lot of the questions that folks like us in an organization that studies the presidency have consternated over during the last 4 years, and perhaps not newly consternated over, but consternated over in a little more focus than perhaps we had before. I'm very cognizant of the fact that we're having this conversation in the middle of an impeachment trial, the second of this presidency, something that is very historic in nature, and of course is coloring the context of the moment. When Jack wrote the book, of course, they didn't know. This was quite some time ago. They didn't know what was coming. Didn't know we'd be in a second impeachment. Didn't know whether President Trump would still be president or whether there'd be a new president in office. And they designed, I think, their recommendations to reflect some lessons from the time that should be applied at whenever the time was appropriate. I believe that time is upon us now. And the new chapter that we're entering in American politics, if we can call it really new, will give us some opportunities to visit some of these questions and perhaps make some progress. Our goal, of course, would be to satisfy the interest of the American citizen, that their government is bounded by the appropriate set of rules and norms, such that our constitutional balance between the president and the Congress can function in actual fact. Um, I will be opening the floor to audience questions. So if anybody wants to go ahead and whenever you feel moved, submit using the Q&A function, and I'll be bringing some of those questions in a little bit later. But let me start by, there's a lot going on right now, but Jack, I want to give you an opportunity to talk to us about the book and kind of what moved you and how did you go through the process of putting your thoughts together, and what are the key takeaways that we need to know about reconstructing the presidency?
So thanks very much, and thanks for having me today. Thanks everybody for attending. So Bob Bauer and I, there's a passage in the book where Bob insisted on including from the piece I wrote on lawfare when he was the White House counsel and I was at Harvard. And I was very critical of Bob about a legal judgment that he gave in the context of the Libya military effort in 2011. And as a result of that, he got in touch with me after government, and we started having conversations about executive power. And we had a long exchange about how to think about being an executive branch lawyer. We became friends, and we were going to write a book about the White House counsel, which is where he worked, and an office that when I was in the Justice Department, I often worked with. There's not a good book about the history of and operation of and need for the White House counsel. We met one day to talk about that book, and then we kept coming back to the Trump presidency in general. We kept talking about the reforms of the 1970s, the many reforms of the 1970s after Watergate and Vietnam and the Church Commission, comprehensive reform of the presidency. And by the end of the day, we had decided that we wanted to write a book about that because we were sure that there was going to at least be a debate about whether the presidency needed to be reformed after Trump, whether that was in 2021 or 2025. And we just wanted to write a book that we didn't know what we were going to talk about. We didn't know if we'd agree on things. We had a little sketch that day. And over the course of the next year, we wrote 420 pages and came up on, the book has 13, 14 chapters. And so let me just say a few things about our starting point. I'll just summarize in very broad terms some of the things we propose. And then I'll say a few other matters, and then I'm happy to have a conversation about whatever you want. Before I get to that, so we actually wrote this book in a way, we had it published, we didn't go through a traditional publisher. We had it published by Lawfare, the Lawfare site, and it was really, the book is basically self-published on Amazon. And the reason we did that was because with Donald Trump, things were changing so fast that we wanted to be able to write right up until publication date. Publication date was September 15th. We wrote up until literally late August. That's unheard of in publishing. And so that was great because a lot of things happened over the summer that we could talk about. But of course, with Donald Trump, a lot has happened since that we don't talk about in the book, including transition reform, which needs to be thought about now. And of course, there's a second impeachment, which raises all sorts of interesting issues. And let me also say, before I get to the book, you talked about how your focus is on the health of the political system. We don't focus on the health of the political system. We take it as we find it. We don't think the political system is healthy, but we take Congress, which is in some sense not operating well right now. We take it as we see it, the courts as we see it, the electoral system as we see it. We don't try to change everything. Given the state of the world, the question is, what can we do about the presidency? Not talking about elections and how to elect better presidents. We're talking about what to do with the presidency. And one assumption of the book is that we need to worry about another populist demagogue like Trump, who's going to be a norm-breaking, law-defying president of his type, which is a very specific type. And it could be a right-wing populist demagogue or a left-wing populist demagogue. It's not clear. But there is a question, if you think we don't have to worry about another Trump coming into office, if we're going to go back to the normal range of presidents who were, in light of Trump, the range between Bush and Obama now looks quite narrow in terms of basic commitment to norms, basic commitment to reasonableness, basic commitment to operation of government. If you think that we're going to be in that mode for a long time, you might think, well, you don't need reforms. We're never going to have another Trump presidency. We don't believe that, and we don't believe that the country can assume that, and it's a dangerous assumption. And moreover, we worry that the next Trump will be a much more clever Trump. Donald Trump, in many ways, was incompetent at running the executive branch. And given his aims and goals, such as they were, he could have been much more effective and much more destructive if he had the wherewithal, which he didn't. So you described our basic take on Trump. He wasn't, this is a controversial thing to say, perhaps, he wasn't a lawbreaker in the traditional sense that a president is a lawbreaker. For example, he wasn't as aggressive as George W. Bush or Barack Obama on war powers. And for example, he wasn't as aggressive at Barack Obama in using executive orders to extend congressional authorizations to achieve policy ends. And he didn't, unlike George W. Bush, he didn't engage in commander-in-chief disregard of statutes like as often as Bush did. And as strange as it seems, I think of those as more normal presidential abuses. Trump's were different. Most of it was rhetoric. A lot of it was lawful, but abuse of power. So much of what he did was within the discretion of the presidency, but norm breaking and an abuse of power. There's a lot of talk about norms, and people are much more cognizant of the role that norms play in governing the president. I'm going to explain in a moment why I think that's inevitable to some degree. But let me just talk about some of our reforms. So the book is broken up into three parts. The first part is called The President. And here, if I had to summarize, and it's a generalization, these are areas of presidential action, not all of them, but most of them, where that used to be governed by, that is currently governed by norms, where the norms worked for the 50 years after Watergate, where Trump showed that the norms could be defied with impunity, and where we think the norms should be made into law. And I'll give 4 examples. We talk about, so tax disclosure, that's a norm that with bipartisan support, every president followed going back to the 70s. Conflict of interest rules, that compliance goes back even further. Those are 2 examples where we don't think the president should have discretion whether to comply as a matter of norms with tax disclosure rules and conflict of interest rules. I can talk about why if you like. We think that should be made into law, and we say how and why. Foreign interference in elections it's not exactly a new problem, but it's a much more salient problem. It's a problem where the law is full of gaps, as the Mueller report shows. And we propose ways to really criminalize and not allow basically mutual aid agreements between a foreign government and a campaign to influence the election. Something that actually goes back to the 1960s, but it's been a real problem in the last 2 elections. Another example is the pardon power. This one's harder. This is an area where presidents have, Donald Trump's not the first president to use the pardon power in what you might think of as an abusive way, in a self-serving and politically self-serving way to help friends and relatives. But he did so in a much higher percentage of cases, like significantly higher percentage of cases. You might remember Bill Clinton's famous controversial pardons at the end of his term. So there's not much you can do to reform the pardon power because it's a constitutional power and it's very broad. And we just have 2 reforms here. I'll just state them briefly, and if you want to talk about them later, we can. And that is, 1, to make clear that a president can commit a crime if he gives a pardon to obstruct justice or in exchange for a bribe. And you might think that's unconstitutional. We don't think it is. I'm happy to talk about that if you want. You might also think that's not very consequential. I think it is consequential. We can talk about that too if you want. We also propose that Congress, I'm not sure this is ever a problem that's going to come up again, but that Congress make clear its view that self-pardons are unconstitutional. That's obviously not binding, but it would influence a court, we think. So the chapter 1 is focusing on the president and mostly areas where norms can and should be made into law. Chapter 2 is the toughest area, and that is reforming. It's called the President and Justice Department relations. It's all the rule of law issues. They're complex and many. I'm not going to get into them except to the extent you want to talk about them. We have some suggestions there, and again, I'll talk about it if you want, about what Congress should do. But the problem here and the challenge is the Constitution, because Article 2 gives the president comprehensive control over law enforcement. And especially with this Supreme Court, there are only a few targeted things that Congress can do to check that. So constraints on the president have to be mostly, or I should say in the executive branch, have to be mostly generated from within through norms. It's my view, and we can talk about this if you want, that the norms were much more consequential than people think, even during the Trump administration. But they need serious bucking up, and we propose lots of ways and lots of dimensions to do that. There's no silver bullet here. The third part is by far the hardest part, and because it involves, and the most controversial in terms of, I actually think that part one, before Trump, there was bipartisan support for just about all of those positions that we basically say should be made into law instead of norms. And the basic rules of Justice Department independence, there's bipartisan support for too. Part three, I'm almost done. Part three is reflects more traditional separation of powers disputes between the president and Congress. War powers, vacancies reform, emergency powers, the subpoena power. There's a chance, I would say, that many of the reforms, I want to emphasize a chance that many of the reforms in part one or two could be implemented. I'm very skeptical that that we're going to see progress on more powers. Perhaps vacancies reform, I can imagine it, but it's going to be very hard. These are areas where we have views, we lay them out, but I don't expect I think that's by far the least likely set of reforms. I think I'll just stop there and take your questions. That's the basic outline of the book. I can't hear you.
Thank you for reminding me. I'm a parent working from home, so I'm trying to avoid the challenge of child-related noise and interrupting you. So I had to remember to come off mute, but thank you for the introduction. Let me start with some questions that are kind of relate to both the book and current events, and maybe some of the overlap between them. But let me start with a really broad question. And this is looking for your opinion, from your current point of view rather than when you were writing the book. But what do you think is the most important lesson of the Trump presidency now that we're in the position to look back upon it?
That's a great question. I think the most important lesson is that we need to be very skeptical about reliance on norms to constrain presidential behavior when legal constraints are available. As I just said, for some areas of the problem, the Constitution makes it very hard, if not impossible, for Congress to regulate. But it was just taken for granted that the president was going to worry about appearances with conflict of interest rules. It was just taken for granted that presidents were going to disclose taxes. It was taken for granted. And again, it was more or less accepted that there were certain norms that presidents would follow in their relations with the Justice Department. I'm not saying, and we lay this out in the book, by the way, it's not just an anti-Trump book. We give the historical background to all of these areas of law. We talk about how prior presidents have followed or not followed these norms. We talk about what was unique about Trump. Barack Obama, in a famous instance, violated the norm against not talking about an ongoing investigation of an executive branch official when he weighed in on the Hillary Clinton investigation, which Comey gave as one reason why he did his extraordinary thing. So there was norm breaking before, and people were, aware of the problem. But I think the one lesson we've learned, I've been studying the presidency for 3 decades, and norms were just not on the radar to nearly the same degree because there was a general acceptance of them. That's what a norm is. And so I just don't think, I think in the current environment in Washington and in the country, despite what I said and believe about norms operating more robustly than people think during the Trump years, and I can talk about that if you want, I just think that we can't depend on those going forward. I mean, there's a general breakdown in institutional culture, norm following. It's not just in the presidency, it's throughout the country. It pervades Washington. I think this is, I don't know if you're dealing with this problem, but this is one of the largest problems the country faces. I don't have a solution for this. It impacts some of our reforms, but in any event, I think that is the biggest picture lesson. I mean, I can go into more detail if you want, but that's
I really am interested to hear you talk a little more about the norms that you felt did hold, because we focused on many that were very publicly tested, and some obviously failed very rapidly. So let me give you an opportunity to talk about ones that you thought you know, on the upside did hold. And let me fold into that a second question, which is how do you address the problem of rhetorical excess? If that is indeed the way that many of these norms are broken down, it's by tweeting and saying incendiary things that in the past we would have said, well, that's not presidential, and we wouldn't expect a president to ever go there, but then they do. Let me see if you can address both of those.
Yeah, I can. I think they relate actually. So we didn't exactly say it in the book, but there's nothing you can do about presidential excess, at least in the very, very, very large room for presidential speech that doesn't violate law. You know, if we do propose that presidential speech be constrained by proposing that Congress, for example, I'm going to go back a little bit, then I'll answer all your questions. But the Mueller report talked about in volume 2 of all the 10 instances when Trump may have obstructed justice or attempted to obstruct justice. That was just speech on the part of the president. He was trying to get people to do things. That's not the kind of rhetorical excess you're talking about. You're talking about the tweeting, the attacking institutions, the attacking individuals, the riling up of crowds. That is very, very, we don't propose to directly control that because I don't think you can. You can, however, take steps to control the consequences of that. So if a president is going to be trying to get his Justice Department to do things that we think are wrong, you can establish systems and norms that will make it harder, not impossible, not impossible, but make there be more friction to for the president to be able to do that, which leads me to the areas in which I think norms work. So think about volume 2 of the Mueller report. Volume 2 of the Mueller report is a remarkable document because it's basically a story of the president of the United States, most powerful man in the world, and certainly of the executive branch, with strict hierarchical control over everybody underneath him, trying to stop the Mueller investigation. And he couldn't do it because none of his senior officials, McGahn, Rosenstein, Papadopoulos, and others, they just wouldn't carry out his wishes for one reason or another. And those reasons were, and we've learned this from memoirs, and it's also in the Mueller report, a combination of norms and legal concerns. They knew it was wrong. They knew they would get in trouble. They knew it would be bad, and they didn't do it. That's an example, and it didn't happen. If you go back and read the newspapers for 18 months, there was panic that Mueller wasn't going to be able to finish his report. Mueller did finish his report. There was panic that it wasn't going to be disclosed. It was disclosed. Now, people weren't happy with what happened after that. But in terms of Bob Mueller being able to finish his work, that's an example of the norms really did work there. Other examples were, you know, Barr violated a bunch of norms, but he had some remarkable examples of norm compliance. He ignored the president's wishes to to prosecute his enemies. That the president was over and over again trying to get him to do that. Barr wouldn't do that. Why not? Everyone thought Barr was a lackey for the president. Barr did things vis-a-vis Trump's friends that many people thought were Barr serving as a lackey. I'm not defending Barr, and I've been very critical of him, but I think it's more complicated than that. And Barr didn't do a lot of things he wanted. Barr, in many instances, reaffirmed Barr, who his whole career has been against the Inspector General, reaffirmed the legitimacy of the Inspector General and deferred to the Inspector General in some very important ways. Barr didn't publish the Durham report or its consequences before the election, complying with the 60-day rule. He could have done that. There were just a bunch of things. And I'm not saying, by the way, I want to emphasize that Barr was not an angel. I'm not saying that, but these are all instances where the norms had bite.
Let me follow up on that question. That this isn't really a question about turning something from a norm to a law, but just on your opinion on a norm. What is the appropriate level of friction that ought to exist in the executive branch to the president? And this comes back to this question of, you know, some would argue that any resistance to the president's order is like sort of deep state. It's inappropriate. It's preventing the president from enacting a mandate delivered by the people to govern the country. But we have seen, as you suggested, many instances where there are times when presidents need a little, even if you just say charitably, a little breathing room between emotive response to something and actually carrying it out into policy and law.
Yeah.
There is some room also for exposing some of the president's orders to the light of the press And, we all hate leaks to a certain extent, but because then you are forced to let the public see it. And then if it's okay, if the policy is correct, then, there's not a political price to continue. Talk a little bit about the appropriate friction.
So it's a great question and a great point, but it's very hard to generalize about it. Really depends on the context. I mean, ultimately, the president, there's some legal constraints, but ultimately the president can fire anyone in the executive branch. And therefore, he has the power to tell them that's too strong. He can certainly fire any of his senior, he can fire the attorney general. And if the attorney general doesn't carry out his wishes, he can fire him. And he can do that with all the cabinet officials and with lots of officials below that without any reason. And that's the ultimate power behind the president's ability to control the executive branch. So the optimal level of friction, I mean, Trump is thought to be this terribly abusive president, and in many ways he was, but there's never been a presidency in the history of the United States, and I'm sure of this, where so many senior officials so often ignored the president's orders and just defied him. And in some sense, he had terrible control over the executive branch. He got a little bit better as it went on. The normative, it's too hard to answer in the abstract. I mean, Barr ignored Trump when he said prosecute people. Trump could have fired him over that, but who knows if Trump really meant it when he did that. So many officials said they didn't pay attention to his tweets and didn't know what to make of them. It's a harder question when you're talking about leaking. And that's a very controversial issue, but it is a method of checking the president. There was insubordination of forms of sorts in the executive branch, including in the Justice Department. We have a chapter on that because we think the bureaucracy went too far in some respects. I can't generalize, but I will say that the theory of the unitary executive has never been defied so much in practice as in the Trump administration, which is ironic.
You mentioned that for the purposes of the book, you take the political system as it is. I mean, like it or not, you don't address that. You craft.
It's too big a problem.
Well, let's say you craft solutions that you believe will work regardless of whether that changes or doesn't. But one of the areas that we focus on as an institution is that system. And I think we try to take a realistic view as well. And that is to say, it's not rational to expect that a member of Congress is going to do something that will result in their immediate dismissal from the job. Right. It's just not a reasonable thing to expect. Sometimes you might look for that, but that is not something you can build a strategy around. And I think the result of that, given a lot of the systemic incentive problems that exist right now, are that Congress is not well set up in effect to police a president of their own party, and which is also why I think it's struggling mightily with effecting an impeachment that the American people as a whole can say, oh, we accept that is something that the Congress as a whole is doing versus just the parties battling it out through the methodology of an impeachment trial. Yeah. And that puts constraints on or let's say it puts a frame around the urgency of some of the things you're requesting to have changed legally. But I wanted to ask you sort of your thoughts on how much of that reality influenced this. And maybe another way of asking this question is, how many of your reforms result in the end process being the Congress will need to eventually come in versus the Supreme Court and the judicial system will need to come in and enforce this thing? Because if you write a perfect law, but the enforcement at the end of the day it doesn't have the will to enforce it, you have a problem.
So it's a great question. So we tried to operate in the world of the conceivable. In other words, it's not like we think that Congress is going to enact these proposals tomorrow. Obviously, it's a huge lift, every one of them, because everything is a huge lift in Congress. But we did operate in the world of what was conceivable. The Part 3 stuff about war powers was admittedly doesn't necessarily fall into that range. That's much harder. But for most of this stuff, we do think it's conceivable. First of all, a lot of it can be implemented by the executive branch. And a lot of the proposals, then changing the structure of the executive branch to change the norms, clarifying certain norms, that can be done without Congress. But there's a whole bunch of stuff Congress has to do. Almost none of them require, and this was self-conscious, ongoing congressional supervision. because I agree with you, Congress is just not good at that. The hope is that, like in the 1970s, you can have a one-time change where Congress can at one time. But one thing people don't realize is when Congress changes the law, and especially when they criminalize things, that has a massive normative impact throughout the executive branch. I can tell you from personal experience in the Justice Department, a lot of deep personal experience, people in the government are afraid of criminal law. And that includes people in the Justice Department who supposedly control the criminal laws. And that's, by the way, one of the reasons why people wouldn't carry out Trump's wishes. Because even if the president can't be prosecuted for obstruction of justice, and that's a hard legal question, everybody else can. And so you don't necessarily have to have follow up on some of these things, follow up supervision from Congress. You don't necessarily have to have court review on some of these things. We talk about court review. A lot of these, we think you can shape executive branch behavior in a serious way simply by passing the right criminal laws or by passing the right regulatory structure. Sometimes it involves private causes of action and the like. Again, some of these things we get the courts involved. We have a proposal on subpoena power to speed up judicial resolution of that, to kind of have a more level playing field for Congress in the disputes with the president. But for the most part, the hope is that if Congress can do something once, then it will have a continuing impact. And I think that's proven true in a lot of areas. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I have a lot more questions for you, but I also note that our audience has sent a lot of questions in. So I'm going to go ahead and start getting some of those in front of you. And if we get back to mine, great. And if we don't, then I'll have to buy you a beer sometime when we're allowed.
I would love to do that when
we could talk more.
I look forward to the day when I can have a beer with someone again.
Yeah, exactly. Let me start with a question submitted by Mark Lavoda. He says, we saw the Trump administration propose major changes to the civil service, such as Schedule F classification of civil servants in a variety of roles classified as policymaking. We also saw civil servants in acting roles forced out of the civil service or reassigned to roles far afield of their expertise. Do you have any thoughts about the best way to fortify the civil service system?
You know, it's not something we addressed. It's not something I'm expert on. So I don't have great solutions, but it's not something we addressed in full. We talk about vacancies reform, and I can talk about that. I have to say, I looked at the Pendleton Act stuff when Trump, and I looked at the civil service laws and the constitutional issues when Trump made this proposal. And frankly, there's a lot more under the current Supreme Court's law of the executive branch. The president has a much more powerful case for doing the things that Trump proposed to do. Those are not settled legal issues. And I'm amazed that the Trump administration didn't get its act together and do that kind of stuff a lot earlier. They weren't able to implement that, as best I can tell. If I understand the question, they had this executive order near the end where they were going to try to rethink at the top level of the bureaucracy and maybe make them just rearrange them and I think have more political appointees, or maybe they could change the appointees and fire some people. Again, I don't purport to be an expert on this, but the president has a lot more control there than I was aware of. And I just haven't thought about the solution to that. And we do have solutions to, Trump did manipulate loopholes in the Vacancies Reform Act of 1998. He's not the first president to do so, to put in position people who weren't qualified, who were lackeys, into senior positions. And we have lots of reforms to clean that up. That's a hard one. And frankly, there's part of the problem there is that Congress these days, there are 1,200 executive branch officials who require confirmation. The Senate is confirming at a much lower rate and a much slower rate than it used to. So there's a real need for a president to be able to have vacancies filled. But Trump was very good at firing people and then putting in people at the top. So we have reforms for that, but not on the general search not on the question about the bureaucracy generally. And I'm just not an expert on that. I'm sorry.
Okay. Fair enough. Let me follow up with a question from Christian Bale, former OMB civil servant, current Duke law student. I hope you're willing to answer questions from law students from other schools. I have heard the Trump administration moved the executive order review process from the OMB to the West Wing. Is this a major threat to a norm from your point of view? How do you think things like this will be handled in the new administration?
And again, another question I'm not an expert on. I mean, I know a little bit about this process because I dealt with it when I was at the Office of Legal Counsel. Expect, well, here's the problem. So I don't know the answer to this question. I expect that the Biden administration will go back to the more normal OMB process. I don't know how much separation there was between the West Wing and OMB and the old executive office buildings where I think it is. I don't know how much actual separation there was. So I don't know what the significance of putting the policymaking process in the White House. I know the people that I knew in the Obama administration that worked in OMB the senior people had very close ties to the senior people in the White House. I don't have a view on that either. I'm sorry. That's just not something we addressed.
Let me ask you about the press then. You did a chapter on it. I got a question about First Amendment protections and why do you believe we need novel protections for the press from presidential retaliation? What form should such things take? And generally, what are your suggestions? I mean, I was one of those people who was shocked when the president called the press an enemy of the state. And look, I've held elected office, and I've had days when I felt that way. But saying that is a big deal. And but what can you do legally? Because the president can say has First Amendment protections as well. So how do you balance those things?
Nothing you can do legally to stop the president from attacking the press. And we don't purport to try to stop the president from attacking the press. And we talk about the history of the president attacking the press. And there's actually a book published on this. Just as I was finishing this book, I read it, and there's a much longer history than I realized of presidents being really vicious towards the press, including prosecuting members of the press because they were just mad at them. I mean, there are some bad examples, and all sorts of other things going back to the 1790s. Now, I don't want to suggest that Trump is normal because he's not. He was extreme even by the standards set by Richard Nixon. The main thing we worried about, this is a perfect example I talked about, you can't stop presidential speech, but you want to worry about its impact. The main thing we're worried about, the press can take care of itself for the most part, and it did a great job of taking care of itself. And despite Trump's attacks, it flourished under Trump. There are obviously some exceptions, but it flourished under Trump. And what we worry about is using the tools of government to retaliate against the press, something Nixon tried to do, something that we worried that Trump would do. And our solution is to basically empower the Inspector General to examine ex post any instance of an investigation of a reporter that's plausibly in retaliation, so that there's a record. And the idea is not that that will ever happen, but that it would dissuade anyone from doing that in the first place. That's all. We have some other proposals about press access and about the president's Twitter feed being a public record. The truth is, though, these reforms are very modest. President does not have to have press conferences. He does not have to allow people into the White House. He can be discriminatory if he wants in who he allows into the White House or who he decides to give a press conference to. He can say all sorts of vicious things. There is ultimately some sort of legal line depending on, but it's way out there it's very, very extreme. So there's not much you can do about that. We just try to focus on the preventing retaliation.
Great. Let me ask you about nepotism and the Hatch Act. Any thoughts did you deal with nepotism in the book? And do you want to share any thoughts on that and or adding some teeth to the Hatch Act?
Yeah.
And maybe give a little background on the Hatch Act if you want to, for folks who may not understand.
So I'm not, you're asking me about things I'm not expert on, and I'll tell you about the Hatch Act. So Bob, my co-author, is an expert on the Hatch Act. He worked in, this is basically the law that prevents, among other things, it prevents executive branch officials, government officials, from being involved in political campaigns and from using government offices for political purposes. So the Trump, again, I'm not an expert on the Hatch Act. You're asking me about all these things I don't know about, but the Trump, the campaign event that he had during the campaign when he did it from the White House instead of somewhere else, many people thought that was a violation of the Hatch Act. We didn't deal with the Hatch Act, and Bob basically said that it was just too hard to deal with. So I'm just reporting that my because there's so many hard First Amendment issues. But nepotism we did deal with in several places. We think that the tax disclosure rules and the conflict of interest rules have to apply to the president's family if they're working in any capacity related to the executive branch. So his children and his son-in-law, they would have been subject by law to all of the transparency rules, the conflict of interest rules. We think that the obstruction of justice statute that we perform should extend to the president trying to protect his family, the prohibition on so we are worried about that primarily from the conflict of interest perspective, which is different from the Hatch Act. That's more about using the executive branch improperly for political reasons.
Let me ask you a question that occurred to me.
Sorry, the sunshine is coming in. Give me one second.
Go ahead and adjust it however you need to. I want to ask you a question that occurred to me recently when the House was passing the current impeachment article about inciting insurrection, and there were folks that were concerned about what was coming soon because it was like in the moment, right? What if the president pardons the people that attacked the rioters that attacked the Capitol? And there was a lot of consternation about what may happen between the time that January 6th and the 20th. And one thing that I was thinking about was the pardon question. And I know you raised this and you wrote a chapter on it. And I'm sure you didn't deal with this question in the book, but I'm just wondering your legal thoughts on the following idea. It occurred to me that perhaps there ought to be some kind of stipulation that if a president is impeached by the House, that until such time as the Senate could review this, perhaps the presidential pardon power ought to be paused or some limitation placed on it, a congressional review or something with an appropriate time limit, so the House couldn't just turn it off forever. And if the Senate didn't want to hold the trial. But is there anything there that you think legally ought to be revised when it comes to?
Sure, we didn't talk about this problem in the book, but I do have views on it. That can't be done by statute. It would have to be done by constitutional amendment.
Right.
And if you're going to do a constitutional amendment, I think that's too fine-grained in Trump particular. I think a manageable, most of the abuses of the pardon power before Trump and in Trump's presidency, he was unusual in his presidency for giving pardons as favors before the election. Most presidents like Clinton, like George H.W. Bush, they do the controversial pardons after the election's over during the transition because there are no political consequences then, or very few political consequences. Mm-hmm. Trump did probably most of his abusive pardons during the transition. And you're absolutely right. He could have pardoned every single person involved in the insurrection. He could have had a blanket pardon. It could have been written the right way, and it would have been a valid pardon given a bunch of historical precedents. There have been proposals, and I think this isn't a bad proposal, but it would require a constitutional amendment to say that the president can't issue a pardon during the transition period. In other words, try to keep the political consequences of an abusive pardon, ensure that they're still in place, because there aren't such consequences during the transition. So that's kind of along the lines, it gets at the same point you're getting at. I mean, the insurrection and the impeachment could have happened earlier, but I think tying it to impeachment is too particular. I would tie it to the transition. You could also, there are other ways you could do it. You could say you could craft it in a way the president can't pardon family members. President can't pardon anyone in an investigation in which he's a target or subject. I mean, there are lots of different ways to do it, but I think if you wanted to do it in a single sentence that would have maximum impact on the most abusive pardons, you would just say no pardons during a transition. That's when most of the abuses occur.
I actually think that makes a lot of sense in terms of just exposing it to the light of day and the voters. Yeah. Let the president decide if he or she wants to, put that on the table before the voters make a decision about the.
Let me give you an example. George H.W. Bush's Iran-Contra pardons and Bill Clinton's last day pardons that were politically very controversial, they just would not have happened in the year before the election. He wouldn't have done it. Obviously Clinton wasn't running in 2000, but it would have had a bad impact for the Democrats and he wouldn't have done it. He would have done the pardons that could be justified. Now, there's an argument that sometimes people like Cap Weinberger and sometimes people like some of the people Clinton pardoned deserve pardons, but you can't do it unless you can do it during transition because it's too politically hot. But that's just a trade-off I think is worth having.
Yeah, as you suggested, we'd have to perhaps build in some additional extra points on the second term because they don't have the same dynamic. But that's a deep topic for another day. Let me ask you to talk a little bit about special counsels and the Attorney General and their relationship, because you wrote about this, and it seems to me an really important topic because a lot of the argument that you see now about accountability on the president gets countered by this sense of, well, the president's been under attack from day one. You know, his political opponents have been constantly calling for his impeachment, and that's not wrong. And you can have a subjective argument about how much of a factor that should play in today's in the accountability. But so if you wind it back to the early part of the Trump presidency, it was a major part of the history of this presidency, the special counsel being, and the story of how it came together, the politics and the relationship between the president and the attorney general and the special counsel. But can you talk a little about how can we fix or make better the process there to kind of improve
Yeah.
that
So
scenario?
there's no silver bullet here. There's just not a silver bullet. And I'll tell you our thinking on it. So, I'll give you the history very quickly. There was the independent counsel before the Watergate special prosecutor process worked pretty well. It got the job done, even though Nixon tried to fire one. And the reason it worked well is because the politics worked. Basically, the Republicans, after Archibald Cox was fired, basically put pressure on Nixon to give Jaworski more independence, and the rest is history. And it worked great there in retrospect, absent any statute. As you know, there was an independent counsel statute in 78. We did that for 20 years. It was rejected with bipartisan acclaim in 1998. And the idea there was that you actually need to have accountability for independent counsels in the Justice Department. So you had these regulations, and they were the regulations that Mueller operated on. And Mueller's investigation was really the first time these regulations have ever been tested, which is interesting. So we get very much into the weeds of the special counsel. I'll just say a few things about it. One, this is tinkering, because there's just no perfect solution here. There's a trade-off between wanting to have accountability for legal interpretation and accountability for the general thrust of the investigation in the attorney general, wanting to have adequate independence of the independent counsel to ensure that you find out what happened. There's just no way to square that circle and make it perfect. And basically, and again, we have about 10 different reforms. They're not worth talking about. The one big move, and a lot of people won't agree with this, is, well, I can say two. We actually want to strengthen the attorney general's control over the legal issues, but we want to also strengthen the independent counsel's what we call accountability role. This is the most important reform. We think it's vital when there's an investigation, especially of the president or a senior executive official. You can say it's about finding out if someone broke the law. It's really about finding out what happened. It's about serving an accountability function. It's about letting the American people know what happened. We don't think the special counsel should have an impeachment referral power like it did under the 1978 rules. But we think that the special counsel's fact-finding function should be protected from interference from the attorney general, and that in various ways, and that the special counsel should be able to do what Mueller ultimately was able to do, but might not have been able to do, which is to finish his investigation and get the facts out. That's the most important thing, we think. Everything else is tinkering, in my opinion.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the applicability of impeachment versus criminal? We talked a little bit about the fear of criminal proceedings for staff. When it comes to the president, though, it's a special thing. And for good reason. When you talk about criminal, some people have suggested, for example, well, impeachment's not the right remedy right now, given where we were in the presidential term. But there is always the criminal prosecution, either federal or state, and so that's the right way to hold the president accountable. But there is politics in all of this, and so I'm curious for your thoughts about, and this may not be something you really covered so much in the book, but just kind of where we are now. How do you balance the effective sort of deterrent effect of the impeachment clauses versus criminal liability for a president's actions once that person leaves office?
It's a great question. It's a big question. We deal with it in the book, but things have happened since the book. So I'll just tell you generally what I think. This is a very hard problem because there's a rule in the Justice Department. I think it's the right rule, but many people think it's not, that the president cannot be indicted or prosecuted while he's in office, that any criminal acts the president commits in office have to wait until after office to be prosecuted. The remedy for a president that engages in crimes or engages in abuses of office while in office is impeachment. The impeachment power is retarded, by which I mean it's diminished. And listen, Trump has committed by the framer standards probably hundreds of impeachable offenses. And I'm not sure that the Ukraine thing was even in the top 20. I'm not really sure. I do understand why the Democrats chose to do that, but I don't think it was a well-chosen one. What he did on January 6th and frankly, what he did from the day of the election up through the end of his presidency was the clearest example of an impeachable offense or impeachable offenses that have ever occurred in the history of the country. And I include the things Nixon did. If he can't be impeached and convicted, and we can talk about late impeachments and that legal issue if you want here, then really the impeachment power has fallen. There's this famous law review article called Separation of Parties, Not Powers. That's the point you were alluding to earlier, that the natural check of the Congress that the framers assumed would happen in extreme cases and that was on the way to happening in Nixon, it doesn't happen now. And if Trump can't be convicted for what he did after the election, that check is gone. And so you're in a situation, and it's extremely difficult and problematic politically and legally to prosecute a president for criminal acts in office that he took while in office. So you're really in a situation where a willful president like Trump is basically above the law potentially. Now that doesn't mean that he won't face consequences, that he won't be held accountable in other ways. But it is a very, very serious problem. And that's going to be the ultimate meaning, I fear, of his acquittal, which I think is what will happen. Does that answer your question?
Definitely. And there's so much more to go into that, but you really helped my thinking on it. So I appreciate it. Let me go on to another question we got regarding War Powers Act and the lack of legal restrictions on the president's use of nuclear weapons. How do you deal with this in the book? And give us your suggestions on that, because we've got some interest in that particular.
Yeah. So this is not going to happen, but here's what we said. So Trump scared the hell out of a lot of people when he started tweet joking and tweet threatening the leader of North Korea about his button being bigger and threatening to use nuclear weapons. And it's very important to our nuclear deterrence policy and our nuclear deterrence posture that the president can credibly threaten to use nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances. But when we looked at this, and there was actually a hearing on this during the Trump administration for the first time since the 70s, Congress was at least worried enough to have a hearing where there was bipartisan concern about this. There are no legal constraints on the president's ability to use nuclear weapons. There are, and the OLC opinions, where the office where I worked, the opinions there can be read to allow the president to use them. There's statutes that assume the president can use them whenever he wants. The president's ability to use them, on moment's notice is thought to be central to our ability to deter incoming attacks and certain types of serious threats to our national security and those of our allies. So this is a very hard problem. There are ways to put sand in the system if you have a crazy president. That's happened before, and it might have happened here. Basically, what we try to do is to craft a legal restriction. This is a very long conversation, so I'll give you the short version. We try to craft a legal restriction that dovetails with the commonalities of our nuclear deterrence policy going back decades, and saying the president can use nuclear weapons precisely in accordance with our nuclear deterrence posture. And that's basically an extreme national security threat or an incoming nuclear weapon, but not outside that. And the idea there is just to give people in the chain of command a little bit of leverage over a crazy presidential action without, and this is the tricky part, screwing up the potential deterrence of being able to use nuclear weapons at a moment's notice, and not wanting someone in the chain of command to interrupt the president if it's important to launch on a moment's notice. I'm not sure that made sense, but that's basically what we try to do in the book. It's a very hard problem.
I want to try to fold in a question that and my friend and former Congressman Jim Colby asked, and we've addressed various aspects of the relationship with Congress, but he asked about many of the norms you suggest or talked about being cast aside by preceding administrations stem from the failure of Congress to carry out its own constitutional functions. Can you talk about reforming the presidency without talking about the role of Congress? I think we've talked about it a little bit, but I do want to give you an opportunity to reflect a little more on how much the role of Congress question impacted your thinking while you were putting the book together.
Yeah. So I'll say several things about that. So obviously, you could, and we addressed this question right up front in the book. You could say, look, you're trying to jiggle with presidential constraints and presidential norms and guide the president, et cetera. You're focusing on the wrong problem. The problem with the presidency is a problem that stems from Congress's fecklessness, bad electoral rules, and bad norms in the country, et cetera, et cetera. And there's an argument that if you want to fix the presidency, you should fix Congress first. And I believe that there's a powerful argument for that. And it is certainly true that I believe we need a powerful presidency to make the government work and for national security. But I also believe that it's just vital to have constraint and accountability if you're going to have this hugely powerful president. The president would be a much better institution if we had Congress performing its regular functions as an institution, instead of an institution divided by parties. If it actually took an institutional interest vis-a-vis the president, the way the framers hoped, that would improve the presidency, in my view. It would make a lot more friction, but it would also improve the presidency, in my view, in so many dimensions. But we're just not there, and we didn't have proposals for that. And so we crafted that sounds like that's what y'all are working on. We crafted our proposal. So I agree with what I think is the assumption of the question is that that's a source of a problem, but we don't have proposals for that. And I think frankly, you tell me, extremely hard to imagine how to fix, much less fix.
Yeah.
And so we just took that as a given.
It's hard to fix. Look, all these things come together. One of the reasons why reform is hard is if everyone focused on one element of it, it wouldn't work because it's like you have overlapping problems that are scaffolded together. And therefore you're better off having different folks focus on different legs of it. But to some extent, you've got to kind of move the beast at once. So yes, I believe that our work focusing on the political incentive structure, if we're moderately successful, will open up the opportunities for those who focus on trying to promote bipartisanship within the Congress to be more successful. Perhaps the outcome of that will be that they enact some of the ideas you've put forward through the work you've done collecting these ideas in your book. So all these things are connected.
I take it that the key is electoral reform. I mean, members of Congress care more about election, and they're more beholden to the president. And so members of the president's party just aren't going to cross the president except in very extreme circumstances. And that means, that's one way of looking at the problem. And that means you're not going to get Congress acting as an institution except in very, very extreme circumstances.
We agree with that wholeheartedly. And that's why we focus on incentives, because if the incentive to re-election is to focus on fighting very hard against the other party, then that's what members are going to do. And when the incentive becomes to statesmanlike behavior, that's what we're going to see. When the voters demand and reward that, that's what you'll see. But they need a system which helps them do that. And unfortunately, the system right now is knotted up in a way that emphasizes.
And the problem is, how do you unknot it when the system is broken?
If it were easy, none of us would need to work on these things. Yeah. But listen, I promised you we'd finish within an hour. And I just want to thank you for spending the time with us today. I hope people will pick up after Trump Reconstructing the Presidency and take a look in more detail at the recommendations that you and Bob Bauer spent a lot of time putting together, again, before you knew what was going to happen in this election, very thoughtfully looking to the future and giving us a blueprint for a very important conversation. I don't want to miss the opportunity to plug a product that we publish at CSPC called the Presidential Studies Quarterly.
A great publication.
Thank you. Very capably edited by Professor George Edwards, and I just dropped in the chat box, and I just dropped it accidentally to the panelists, so I'm going to do it again to everyone. But please take a look at that resource. But Professor Jack Goldsmith, thank you for the work you did. Thank you for the time you spent today in helping us better understand what the road ahead looks like if we pave it well. So we appreciate it.
Thank you very much for listening. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Take
Bye-bye.
care and be well.